The Faceless Man of Room 413, location, Seattle, Washington. Date, October 2024. When Sarah Milan checked into the Aging Mariners Rest Hotel during a work trip, she expected a quiet, uneventful stay. Room 413 seemed ordinary enough, until the first night. Around 3 a.m., Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of faint, erratic tapping at the window. She dismissed it as branches brushing against the glass, but the tapping persisted every night. On the third night, she decided to investigate. She pulled back the curtain and screamed. Outside her fourth-floor window stood a man. But it wasn't his precarious position on a sheer wall that terrified her, it was his face. Or a lack of one. Smooth skin stretched where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Panicking, Sarah ran to the door, but the hallway lights flickered as she fled. The elevator dinged open, and there he stood, the faceless man, his head cocked unnaturally to one side. Sarah blacked out and awoke hours later in the lobby. Hotel staff claimed no one else had been on her floor that night. She later learned that room 413 was infamous for suicides, with every victim jumping from its window. The Whispers in the Orchard, location, Wiltshire, England. Date, September 2024. In a picturesque English countryside, the Wexler family recently purchased an old farmhouse surrounded by a sprawling orchard. But the idyllic setting hid something sinister. On her first evening alone at the house, 16-year-old Emily Wexler ventured into the orchard to retrieve her cat. As twilight descended, she began to hear faint, overlapping whispers. Convinced it was her imagination, Emily continued calling for her cat. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Turn back," they said, in a chorus of voices. When Emily finally located her cat near a twisted, ancient apple tree, she saw something horrifying. Carved deep into the bark was a fresh message: "Get out." The family brought in a local historian, who revealed that the orchard was once the site of a 17th-century witch trial. Allegedly, those executed swore their spirits would haunt the land until the truth was uncovered. The Wexlers fled the property, leaving their orchard and its secrets behind. The Static in the Attic, location, Melbourne, Australia. Date, November 2024. Julia Torres, a college student renting a small flat in Melbourne, began noticing something odd during her study sessions late at night. Her laptop speakers would emit bursts of static, even when muted. Assuming it was a technical glitch, she didn't think much of it, until the static began forming words. At first, it was faint, "Help me." Then it grew louder, repeating the plea. Frightened but curious, Julia recorded the audio and played it back. Beneath the static was a distinct, guttural voice whispering, "I see you." Things escalated when her attic hatch creaked open on its own one night. Julia gathered the courage to climb the ladder, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Among dusty boxes, she found an old cassette player. When she pressed play, the static blared, and then the voice returned, "You're next." Julia moved out the following day, leaving the landlord a message about the attic. A week later, the landlord contacted her in a panic, saying he'd found no cassette player, only an old, blood-stained shirt buried beneath the floorboards. The Mirror That Moves, location, San Diego, California. Date, August 2024. Tina and Marcus Howard purchased an antique mirror for their new apartment, charmed by its ornate golden frame. But the charm quickly turned to dread. A week after mounting it on their bedroom wall, Tina noticed subtle changes in her reflection. Her face would momentarily appear distorted, with hollow eyes and a slack jaw. One night, Marcus woke up to the sound of the mirror vibrating against the wall. He turned on the light just in time to see the reflection of someone standing behind Tina, who was still asleep. The figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, had no reflection in the room itself. Terrified, they covered the mirror with a blanket and moved it to the garage. That same night, they heard rhythmic tapping coming from below. When they finally smashed the mirror, it didn't shatter like glass, it crumbled into a fine, black dust. The couple now refuses to have any mirrors in their home. The Haunted Hiking Trail, location, Banff National Park, Canada. Date, October 2024. A group of friends set out to hike a lesser-known trail in Banff National Park, aiming for a secluded overnight camp. As night fell, they began to hear what sounded like footsteps trailing them, despite being miles from the nearest trailhead. At one point, a distinct voice called out a name, Brian. Brian, one of the hikers, froze. His late father had passed years ago, and the voice sounded eerily like his. The group laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. But later, when they set up camp, they found an old photograph tucked inside Brian's backpack, one of him and his father, smiling together. He swore he hadn't packed it. As they slept, the voice returned, louder, circling the tent. In the morning, the group discovered strange symbols etched into the dirt around their campsite. They cut their trip short, but Brian still hears that voice whenever he's alone at night. The Phone That Never Died location, Kyoto, Japan. Date, November 2024. Naomi Tanaka inherited an old flip phone from her grandfather, a memento of simpler times. Though it hadn't worked in years, she kept it in a drawer as a keepsake. One rainy evening, while sorting through her belongings, the phone suddenly turned on, its screen flickering to life. The phone displayed an incoming call from her grandfather's number. Naomi froze, her heart pounding. Her grandfather had passed away 5 years earlier. Against her better judgment, she answered. Static filled the line at first, then came her grandfather's voice, weak and desperate, "Help me. I'm cold." Naomi immediately hung up, but the phone wouldn't stop ringing. It rang all night, even after she removed the battery. The next day, the phone was gone, replaced by a neatly folded note in her grandfather's handwriting, "Don't forget me." The Phantom Choir location, Rome, Italy. Date, September 2024. Late one night, tourists walking near an abandoned church in Rome reported hearing faint choral singing. Intrigued, they entered the church, its doors creaking open as if inviting them inside. The singing grew louder, filling the air with hauntingly beautiful harmonies, though no one could see its source. One visitor recorded the event, only to realize later that the audio picked up strange, whispered phrases in Latin beneath the music. A local historian later translated them, "Save us. They won't let us leave." The church had been deconsecrated decades earlier, following reports of a priest who locked members of his congregation inside during a fire, trapping them as part of a divine offering. The tourists claim they heard faint screams as they fled the building. The Vanishing Patient location, Houston, Texas. Date, July 2024. Nurse Claudia Ramirez was working the night shift at a hospital when she was assigned to care for an elderly woman named Mrs. Olson. Claudia entered the woman's room to find her sitting upright in bed, smiling faintly. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Olson said. "I've been waiting for someone to see me off." Claudia didn't think much of it until she left the room to fetch medication. When she returned, the bed was empty. Confused, she checked the records. There was no patient registered under that name. Thinking it was a mix-up, she called security to help locate the woman. Security cameras revealed something chilling. Claudia had entered the room and spoken to someone, but the footage showed her standing in an empty room, gesturing as if speaking to thin air. Staff later revealed that Mrs. Olson had died in that room 10 years ago, always wishing someone had been there to say goodbye. The Clock That Never Ticks location, Prague, Czech Republic. Date, November 2024. During a vacation in Prague, Tomas Polak purchased an antique grandfather clock from a quaint shop tucked away in a quiet alley. The shopkeeper warned him it was a silent piece the pendulum would swing, but no ticking or chimes would ever sound. Tomas assumed the clock was simply broken and found the oddity charming. Once home, strange things began happening. The clock's hands moved backward each night, resetting to 3:33 a.m. without explanation. Worse, Tomas began waking at that exact time, his dreams filled with a raspy voice whispering, "Fix me." One night, frustrated, he removed the pendulum, hoping to stop the mechanism. But at 3:33 a.m., the clock began ticking loudly. He rushed to the room and saw the pendulum swinging on its own, though it had been removed. The clock struck 3 times, then fell silent. Tomas later discovered the clock's original owner had died at precisely 3:33 a.m. 75 years ago. The clock now sits in his basement, draped in black cloth, though Tomas still hears faint ticking on quiet nights. The Girl in the Basement location, Salem, Massachusetts State, October 2024. Jessica Moore moved into a historic home in Salem, drawn to its colonial charm. While exploring the basement, she noticed child-sized handprints pressed into the cement walls, as though someone had pushed their hands into the wet surface long ago. The previous owner claimed they were from decoration during renovations decades prior. Soon after, Jessica began hearing soft giggles coming from the basement at night. She dismissed it as the old house creaking, until the giggles turned into sobs. Venturing downstairs with a flashlight, she found a damp trail leading to the handprints. Above them, freshly scratched into the cement, were the words, "Play with me." Jessica called in a medium, who claimed the spirit of a little girl was trapped there, tied to a dark event from the house's past. The medium tried to cleanse the home, but Jessica fled before the session was over, unable to endure the sounds of nails scratching against the walls. The Shadow Over the Highway location, Phoenix, Arizona. Date, August 2024. Truck driver Eddie Vargas was driving through the Arizona desert late at night when he noticed his headlights dimming, despite no mechanical issues. As he slowed down, a massive, humanoid shadow crossed the highway ahead, blocking the entire road. Eddie slammed on the brakes, thinking it was a trick of the light or exhaustion, but as he stared, the shadow moved unnaturally, almost as if sliding instead of walking. Suddenly, it turned toward him. 2 glowing red eyes blinked open, locking onto his truck. In a panic, Eddie reversed, but the shadow surged forward, appearing closer with each passing second. When it reached the truck, Eddie passed out. Hours later, he was found by a passing motorist, slumped over his steering wheel. His truck's engine was cold, as though it had been parked for days. Eddie refuses to drive that stretch of highway now, convinced he encountered something ancient and malevolent at night. The Toy That Cries location, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Date, September 2024. When 8-year-old Caleb received a vintage teddy bear from his grandmother, he was thrilled, until the bear started crying at night. At first, his parents thought it was a hidden sound box malfunctioning. But when they opened the bear, they found nothing but stuffing inside. The crying grew louder and more human-like, sometimes accompanied by soft whispers that Caleb said came from the bear itself. One night, Caleb's mother awoke to find the bear sitting upright on the living room couch, though it had been left in his room. Its glass eyes seemed to glint in the moonlight, almost alive. Desperate, the family burned the bear in their backyard, only to find it back on Caleb's bed the next morning, its fur untouched. The grandmother, shaken by the story, revealed she had bought it from an estate sale of a family whose young son had died tragically. Caleb's parents have since moved, leaving the bear behind. The Hospital Room That Isn't Their location, Detroit, Michigan. Date, November 2024. A paramedic, Lisa Grant, rushed a patient to St. Vincent's Hospital during a particularly chaotic night shift. When she arrived, the staff directed her to room 324, an overflow unit for emergencies. After stabilizing the patient, Lisa noticed how eerily cold and dimly lit the room was. She also felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Hours later, when she went to check on the patient, the room was gone. Confused, Lisa asked the nurse on duty, who looked at her strangely. "There's no room 324, the nurse said. "That wing's been closed for years." Lisa checked her patient records, which listed room 324 clearly. Determined to understand what had happened, she returned to the wing. There, she found a padlocked door and a plaque that read, "Dedicated to those lost in the 1975 fire." Since then, Lisa has started dreaming of the burned faces of patients she never met, their hollow eyes staring at her through the flames. The Elevator to Nowhere location, Singapore. Date, October 2024. Late one evening, businessman Aaron Lee stepped into his apartment building's elevator, pressing the button for the 15th floor. The ride started normally, but after passing the 10th floor, the lights flickered, and the elevator came to a halt. The doors opened to reveal a dim, endless hallway filled with flickering fluorescent lights. Aaron stepped out cautiously, calling for help. The hallway seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, and every door he tried was locked. As he began to panic, the elevator doors behind him closed, and the car disappeared. Hours passed, or so it seemed, before he noticed a figure at the far end of the hallway, a woman in white, her face obscured by long black hair. She began moving toward him, her footsteps silent but unnervingly fast. Just as she reached him, Aaron woke up inside the elevator, now on the 15th floor. Security footage later revealed that Aaron never left the elevator, yet his watch showed 3 hours had passed. The Singing Doll Location, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Date, October 2024. Clara Alvarez inherited a porcelain doll from her late aunt, a beautifully detailed figure in a red Victorian gown. The doll sat quietly on a shelf until one stormy night, when Clara heard faint humming coming from her living room. She crept downstairs and froze. The doll's head had turned toward the window, and its painted lips were moving ever so slightly, forming a soft, eerie tune. Terrified, Clara locked the doll in a cupboard. The next morning, she found it sitting at the dining table, its tiny porcelain hands resting neatly in front of it. She tried to dispose of the doll by leaving it at a charity shop, but the following day, it was back on her shelf, humming louder than ever. Desperate, Clara took the doll to a priest, who claimed it was inhabited by a spirit seeking attention. When the doll was burned, Clara heard one last mournful song echoing in her ears before it crumbled to ashes. The humming has since stopped, but Clara still feels watched. The Phantom School Bus Location, Austin, Texas. Date, September 2024. Late one evening, Daniel Carter was driving home when he noticed a school bus parked on the side of a rural road, its hazard lights flashing. He slowed down, thinking it might be an emergency, but as he approached, he realized something was off. The windows were dark, and though the bus looked old, its paint was unusually pristine, almost glowing. Curious, Daniel pulled over. As he stepped closer, he heard children's laughter echoing from inside the empty bus. Suddenly, the hazard lights blinked off, and the laughter turned to muffled screams. The bus's engine roared to life, and it sped away, vanishing into thin air. Later, Daniel learned that decades ago, a school bus full of children had plunged into a nearby river, killing everyone on board. Local legend claims the bus reappears on the anniversary of the tragedy, forever trapped between worlds. The Room That Shifts. Location, Cape Town, South Africa. Date, November 2024. Nina Jacobs, a freelance writer, rented a small studio apartment to focus on her work. The apartment seemed perfect, quiet, cozy, and affordable. But soon, Nina noticed something strange. Items would go missing, only to reappear in odd places, like her toothbrush in the freezer or her laptop in the bathroom cabinet. One evening, she noticed the walls seemed closer. She measured the room and found it had shrunk by 2 feet. Each night, the walls crept inward, the ceiling lowering as well. By the 4th night, Nina was huddled on the bed, the walls now pressing against her knees. Fleeing the apartment, she returned with a friend the next day, only to find the room had returned to its original dimensions. The landlord claimed no alterations had been made, but Nina refused to stay another night. To this day, she can't explain what happened or why she feels her reflection is slightly off whenever she passes a mirror. The Ashen Handprint. Location, Krakow, Poland. Date, October 2024. During renovations of a 19th-century townhouse, contractor Marek Nowak uncovered a hidden fireplace sealed behind a wall. Excited by the find, Marek cleared away the bricks, revealing a soot-blackened interior. Inside the fireplace was an ancient, charred handprint pressed against the stone. That night, Marek's crew reported hearing loud banging noises coming from the house. When Marek arrived to investigate, he found fresh handprints, this time in ash, trailing from the fireplace to the bedroom walls. Each handprint was larger than a human hand, with fingers too long and unnaturally thin. The house was blessed by a priest, but the noises persisted, and workers began reporting nightmares of being pulled into a burning room by skeletal hands. The project was abandoned, and the house now sits unsold, its fireplace covered in thick black tar that never seems to dry. The Flickering Forest location, Trondheim, Norway. Date, September 2024. Hikers in a dense Norwegian forest began reporting strange lights appearing between the trees. At first, the lights resembled fireflies, but as witnesses got closer, they saw humanoid figures illuminated from within, their translucent bodies glowing softly. One hiker, Erik Solstad, decided to follow the lights deeper into the forest. As he approached, the figures seemed to fade, leading him further and further away from the trail. When he finally caught up, he found himself standing in a ring of ancient stones, the glowing figures now surrounding him. They began to whisper in a language Erik didn't understand. He blacked out and woke up the next morning at the edge of the forest, with no memory of how he got there. His compass, watch, and phone were all mysteriously shattered. Locals believe the lights are the spirits of those who died in the forest during a long-forgotten battle, eternally luring the living to join them. The Door That Opens to Nowhere location, Savannah, Georgia. Date, August 2024. While touring an abandoned mansion in Savannah, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon a heavy wooden door bolted shut with rusted chains. Thinking it was a hidden storage room, they broke the chains and forced the door open, only to find an impenetrable wall of blackness on the other side. One of the explorers reached out to touch the void and immediately screamed, pulling back his hand. His skin was ice cold and covered in a strange frostbite-like pattern. Suddenly, the darkness surged outward, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging the group into chaos. They fled the mansion, leaving the door wide open. Locals say the house was once owned by an eccentric collector who tried to summon otherworldly beings. It's rumored the door is a portal to another dimension, one best left unopened.